All right, everybody. We are going to get started and learn today about the Phillips curve and the Phillips curve graph and all that it represents. So I'm going to start off by just giving you kind of the definition of what the Phillips curve is all about. And as you can see in the screen, the Phillips curve shows the relationship or trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And one thing that you can see on the graph is that our Phillips curve, you see we have on the vertical axis, we have the inflation rate, and on the horizontal axis, we have the unemployment rate. And the unique thing about our Phillips curve is it looks like a demand curve. It's downward sloping, but it's not really a demand curve. This is one graph that we have that doesn't really have a demand curve. It represents different things, okay? It represents that relationship between just unemployment and inflation. Now, what you're going to find with this graph is that it actually correlates or corresponds to our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. And I'll show you some examples of that later on in the lesson. But first, the determinants of, and I put down SRPC, that really represents short-run Phillips curve, okay? The determinants of the short-run Phillips curve are anytime the aggregate demand curve changes. Okay, so if there's something that's happening with spending, right, aggregate demand represents spending, then that's going to cause a movement along our short-run Phillips curve in the opposite direction. So, and I have an example that I'm going to show you in just a minute, but let's just say that we had an increase in spending taking place in the economy. Well, an increase in spending would translate into an increase in aggregate demand or a rightward shift of aggregate demand. So on our Phillips curve, we would move along our SRPC to the left in the opposite direction, okay? And when we have a change in our SRES, that's going to create a shift in the entire SRPC curve in the opposite direction. So if something's going to cause our SRES to decrease and shift left, then we would move the entire SRPC to the right. Okay, so those are a little bit about our determinants. Now going back to the graph, okay, what you can see is at point A, when we're on our Phillips curve at point A is representing the actual inflation rate and the actual unemployment rate in that economy. Okay, so if we moved, let's just say that we moved to the left, and we moved to point B on our Phillips curve. If that happened, what you can see then in that economy is you would expect that the inflation rate would increase because the new inflation rate would be at I1, we'll call it, and the unemployment rate would decrease because the new unemployment rate would be at U1. Okay? So what we're doing is we're saying, well, when there's a change in aggregate demand or when there's a change in aggregate supply, we can use the Phillips curve to identify exactly how unemployment and inflation are going to be impacted by that situation. Okay? And going back to our definition, last thing here before we move on, is that this curve shows the relationship or the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And the trade-off is, the way this curve is sloped, anytime we move along that Phillips curve, when we move from A to B, right, we're gaining inflation and we're giving up unemployment. Or if we moved in the opposite direction, we would be, losing inflation, but we'd be gaining unemployment. And so that curve represents, if we want lower inflation, we're going to have more unemployment. If we want lower unemployment, we're going to have more inflation. That's the trade-off that is referring to, okay? So if I move along here, I have a couple examples here. Let's take a look at example 1. Okay, you can see I have a Phillips curve graph. We're going to start at point A, and I give you a scenario here to the right. It says that there's an increase in government spending. And hopefully we know by now that an increase in any spending is going to cause an increase in aggregate demand. Okay? Now we need to make sure we understand that an increase in AD means that we're going to shift that to the right. Sorry for the sloppy handwriting. So what that means then is I'm going to move along the SRPC in the opposite direction, which is going to be to the left. Oops. So if we take a look over here, we started at point A. We had an increase in aggregate demand, so our AD curve on the AD, SRAS graph would be shifting right. So on our short run Phillips curve, we're moving from point A to point B, okay? And so what this graph then illustrates to us is that when we have an increase in aggregate demand, that's going to cause an increase in inflation in our economy, and it's going to cause a decrease in unemployment, okay? That's specifically how unemployment and inflation are going to change. And so our Phillips curve represents that concept, okay? Now, moving on to example 2, a little different scenario here. We have our Phillips curve graph. We're starting at point A, and we have an increase in resource prices happening in our economy, and so that's going to cause a decrease in our SRAS. Now, remember, left is always less, so our SRAS then would be shifting to the left. Okay, so go back to your SRPC determinants. If our SRAS shifts left, we're going to move the entire SRPC in the opposite direction. So in this scenario, we would be moving to the right. So if we look at our graph, we started at point A. SRAS would have been shifting left. So we move our whole curve to the right. So we'd be going from point A to point B on our graph. And you can see that our point moves diagonal with our shift in the SRPC. And so then that illustrates to us that because of the increase in resource prices, we can expect to see an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. Okay? Now remember, just to kind of bring this full circle, we had said previously, I believe this was in Unit 3, that when there's a scenario that we have an increase in resource prices, okay, and the SRAS shifts left, the slang word for this scenario would be that we have cost push inflation, also known as stagflation. So we can illustrate cost push inflation and stagflation on our Phillips curve as well as on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. Okay? You would shift your SRAS left on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. On the Phillips curve, you shift the SRPC to the right. I always refer to this scenario as double whammy bad because we have an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. Double whammy bad. Both bad scenarios. Okay? But those are two examples of how you would make changes using your Phillips curve. Okay? And if you can make that connection between changes in aggregate demand and changes in aggregate supply and your Phillips curve graph, I think it keeps that the Phillips curve fairly simple to remember. Okay, so far we've been talking about the short run Phillips curve only, okay? But just like we've had in other graphs and concepts we've learned, there's also a long run Phillips curve, okay? So this is your long run Phillips curve. It's a vertical line. You can see it on our graph below. We label it LRPC, okay? And if you look at the definition that I have down here, I said it's the curve that represents the level of inflation when the economy is operating at the natural level of unemployment. So we need to understand that, we've always said in the long run, the economy will get back to long run potential, right? And when we're at our long run potential, our unemployment rate is always going to be within that 4 to 6% range. Well, what our Phillips curve graph represents about this concept is that when we're at long run equilibrium, right? That's what our LRPC represents. It represents the amount of unemployment we're going to have in the long run, which we know is 4 to 6%. So on our Phillips curve graph, we label that as 5%. Okay? We're acknowledging that we know, the natural rate of unemployment is the level of unemployment we're going to have in the long run. That's 4 to 6%. Now, what this graph shows us then is that really the unemployment rate can be at any level in the long run. Okay? But in the long run, we're always going to have that 4 to 6% range unemployment. Okay? So point A shows us that in this scenario, our economy is operating at our long run level of unemployment, 5%, and we have inflation at I. Okay? And so what we can see in this graph is, we said before, in the short run, there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. But in the long run, there is no trade-off. Okay? We will always have 5% unemployment in the long run, regardless of the inflation rate. Okay? All right. Now, we're going to kind of try to put this all together. Moving on here. I know it looks like a lot, but we've got 3 different examples where we're illustrating our economy. Okay? So just look at example A for right now. We've got our Phillips curve. Okay? Our Phillips curve is operating at point A. And remember, point A means that we have an inflation rate that is at our long-run unemployment rate of 5%. Okay? This Phillips curve graph would be the equivalent to our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph when we're at long-run equilibrium. So those two graphs represent really the same thing. Okay? Remember, the Phillips curve is just giving us a snapshot of the inflation rate and the unemployment rate in that economy that we're illustrating with our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. Okay? So if something happened, and let's just say that there was an increase in aggregate demand, okay, call that AD1. Well, now we've shifted the AD to the right, so we'll take our Phillips curve, we move along our Phillips curve in the opposite direction. We would move to the left, okay? We'll call that point B. So point B on our Phillips curve and point B on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph really represent the same thing, okay? What we saw on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph is that there would have been an increase in price level and an increase in GDP, right? Well, our Phillips curve shows us specifically that when that change would happen, there would be an increase in inflation and a decrease in unemployment. So those two graphs, they go together. They correspond with one another, okay? All right, moving down. Let's take a look at example B. Now we've got an economy where point A is to the right of our long-run Phillips curve. Well, now let's quickly take a look or think back to what does that long-run Phillips curve mean? The long-run Phillips curve measures the level of unemployment in the long run, right? So if we're at point A, that means we have more unemployment. You can barely see it in there, but U represents our current unemployment rate. We have more unemployment than what we naturally would like to have, okay? Well, hopefully you can think about that and know that, well, that must mean that our economy is in a recession, right? And so when we have a point that's to the right of our LRPC, that's just using the Phillips curve to illustrate a recession, okay? So what I drew on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph is a graph that illustrates a recessionary gap, okay? So these two graphs in example B really represent the same thing. And moving on to example C, last example. So if point A in example B was to the right of the LRPC, now we have point A in example C to the left of our LRPC. So thinking about what that must represent is that means that we have a lower unemployment rate than normal, and you can see I have a higher inflation rate than normal because my normal inflation rate would be right where this intersection is. That was bad dotted lines there. Holy smokes. Try that again. Not much better, but you get the idea. So normally we would like to be at I, the red I, okay? But we have a higher inflation rate than normal, so that must mean that we have some inflationary problems, okay? And so on our graph, you can see that I drew an inflationary gap, showing that we're producing Y, remember, is outproducing our potential, okay? And that economy is going to be susceptible to inflation. So in example C, okay, an inflationary gap, and having our point A on our Phillips curve to the left of the LRPC, those two things really represent the same concept.
Dad,
okay?
this is on Mom.